Hello everybody, welcome back to the study. We are in Luke chapter 5, verses 33 through 39 today. If you'd like a copy of these notes, you can get them. They're in the link in the description down below. And we've also done some studies through the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, John, and those are online, and they have notes on our website at tobelikechrist.com. Today, we're going to talk about a really interesting parable, and I'm kind of excited to talk about it because I get a chance to tell you why I think I got the interpretation of this text wrong originally. And since then, it seems like it's kind of clicked into place. And I think my mistake is something that maybe we can all learn from, and it's just a good tip for just Bible study in general. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but let's talk about what's going on here. Let's read verses 33 through 39. And they said to him, that's to Jesus, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece of a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst, and it will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says, the old is good. So at this point, John, you remember John, Zachariah and Elizabeth's son? He had been preaching, but he had been arrested by Herod, and he had been thrown into prison. And although this detail is absent from Luke's account, Matthew chapter 9, verse 14 tells us that the people who asked this question about fasting, they were actually John's disciples. So they came up and they said, why is it that we fast and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast, Jesus? In the Old Testament, fasting was specifically commanded on one day, on the Day of Atonement. However, we find out from history and some of the statements in the Bible that fasting was regularly practiced, even on a weekly basis, by many religious Jews. And according to these disciples, both the followers of John and the Pharisees participated in this kind of voluntary fasting, even though they were really very different on a lot of other levels. And these men wanted to know why Jesus' disciples didn't fast. And to understand Jesus' response, it's important to understand a little bit more about fasting, why it was done and when it was done. So fasting was often coupled with prayer. We see that throughout the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts. And in verse 33, I have reference there. Why do I have that referenced? Oh, it says the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers. Right, so those two things usually seem to be coupled together. And fasting was often done when a big decision needed to be made. Somebody was looking for guidance during times of trial and times of sorrow. Jesus used an illustration that appears several times in the scriptures, and that is, he illustrates himself and his followers as a bride and a bridegroom, him being the bridegroom and his disciples being the bride. And he said, if my disciples, where did that go? This is a paraphrase, but this is not the time for my followers to be fasting and to be sorrowful, because God, the Messiah, right? I am here with them, and I am able to communicate with them and have fellowship with them, and I've come to bring salvation to the world. So this isn't a time of sorrow. This isn't a time of desperate need for guidance, because I'm here with my followers to guide them and to show them the right path and to bring them good news. This should be a time of rejoicing, like a wedding, not a time of sorrowful fasting. A day would come when Jesus would leave his disciples when he would go back to heaven. And he says that then there would be some times for fasting, but not now. And we do see fasting happening in books like the book of Acts, chapter 13 and chapter 14. Okay, now, kind of the trickier part of this text. Jesus then tells them a parable in order to illustrate, seemingly to illustrate the point that he's just made. He gives two illustrations in this parable that we need to understand in order to be able to understand his meaning behind giving this. So the first illustration is, he says that you don't put a new piece of cloth on an old garment. Have you ever, well, why is that? Why don't you put a new piece of cloth on an old garment? Like if you're patching up an old garment, you don't put a new piece of cloth as the patch and try to patch up an old pair of jeans or khakis or whatever they were wearing around back then. And why? Well, have you ever bought a new sweater and it fit great in the store? You tried it on and you wear it once and it's like, oh man, this feels great. It looks good on me. It fits just so. And then you wash it and it shrinks and it never fits the same again. I've had a few sweaters like that and it's always super disappointing. But we know that phenomenon of that new cloth still has shrinking to do in the washer. However, you know that sweater that you've had for like 7.5 years, that's been in your closet that you wear all the time, and it has a couple holes in it. Well, when you wash that sweater, it doesn't shrink anymore, right? You can always trust that sweater is going to be the same size when you pull it out of the washer. And this shrinking phenomenon is the reason that you don't put a new patch on an old garment, because the new patch still has shrinking to do. And so when you patch up whatever hole that is in your old garment with a new piece of cloth and you cover it just to the right dimensions and you put the stitches in, what's going to happen is that when you wash that thing the next time, that new piece of cloth is going to try to shrink, but the old garment's going to remain the same. And so it's actually going to tear the old garment even worse and make the whole thing just a bigger problem than it was in the beginning. So that's the first illustration that Jesus presents. The second one is kind of similar. It's more about expansion rather than shrinking. And for most modern readers, unless you work in a vineyard, this is probably not going to be quite as relatable, but it's still pretty easy to understand. This illustration involves the fermentation process of grape juice and wine. So in the first century, grape farmers would often take their freshly harvested grapes and then they would put them in wineskins, which were containers that were made out of animal skins. I put a picture in the notes there of a very rudimentary looking wineskin, but it might help to give you the point. Jesus said that you don't put new wine or new grape juice into old wineskins. Why? Well, it's because new wine, as it ferments, it expands. And if you, in old wineskins, if you put that new wine into old wineskins, the new wine is going to expand, but the old wineskins, they're no longer flexible. They're no longer expandable and pliable any longer. So they're not going to expand with the new wine, and eventually the pressure builds up to such an extent that wherever the weakest point in that wineskin is, it's going to burst, and your wine's going to go everywhere, and you're not going to have any, and the whole thing's going to be ruined. Right? You're supposed to put new wine into new wineskins, because those new wineskins will expand with the expanding new wine as the fermentation process takes place. Then you won't, lose everything that you've worked for. Okay, so those are Jesus's two illustrations, and now we got to figure out, why does he bring those up? What's the point? And this is where I want to talk about how I think I got this text wrong originally. There might be some validity to my original understanding of this text and to the understanding that's written down in the book, but there's definitely a good lesson here to be learned, if nothing else. So let me talk about my original, more complex understanding of this text that I've got written down here, and then I will give you another interpretation afterwards. So, all right, what should we make of this question about fasting and these two illustrations about garments and wine? You'll notice in my notes I say there, before we take a shot at the interpretation, I should say that I find this interpretation, or that I find the interpretation of these parables to be a bit challenging. Sometimes you read a text and you think that you have kind of a workable understanding of it, interpretation of it, but it just doesn't like click into place. Sometimes you read a Bible text and you labor over it and you try to understand it, and then it clicks into place and you're like, yes, I've got it, and you're satisfied. You're pretty confident that you figured it out. And sometimes that just doesn't happen, especially on harder texts. That was kind of where I was with this one. So anyway, I wrote, I think what Jesus was trying to communicate here was that his teaching, the new covenant that he was delivering, was not going to be just some kind of patched up version of the Old Testament law of the Jews. And if the Jews, or the disciples of John, tried to interpret it that way, that it was nothing more than their old traditions with a few, new flavors or new attributes added in, then they were going to miss the point of Jesus' ministry. And this was a really important point for the Jews to grasp, because as we know from reading the rest of the epistles and the history of the early church, the Jews really had a hard time separating the law of Moses from the law of Christ and kind of making the dividing line where it needed to be between those two things. So what Jesus was communicating here was that these two elements, they were very different and they couldn't necessarily work together. So let me explain. So under the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, a person attempted to be justified by their works, by keeping the law. However, in Jesus' new covenant, that wasn't the case. A person is saved by the grace of God and is justified through the death of Jesus and what he did on the cross. And it's having faith in him that justifies us, right? So we have, on the basis of justification, or the topic of justification, the answers to those two covenants are wildly different. And really, they cannot be brought together. Justification in the old law and the new law don't mix, and by using these illustrations, Jesus was trying to communicate that. Just like a new patch doesn't match with an old garment, just as new wine doesn't match with old wineskins, the new law and the means by which a person is justified can't be mixed with the works-based justification of the Old Testament law. The new covenant cannot be contained in the same rituals and practices of the old. And then we have to deal with verse 39. So this is definitely a tricky verse if you take the interpretation that I wrote down here. It says, Jesus says there, "And no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good." All right, and the reason that's kind of tricky is because they use that word old and new, and Jesus says that the old is to be preferred. Is he saying the Old Testament law is to be preferred? No, I don't think so. He's here just describing a very common preference that people have. Old vintages of wine, even older juice, is considered better tasting than newer wine. If you go to I don't drink, but if you go to a fancy restaurant and you order a bottle of wine, you're going to pay more for the older bottle usually than you are for the newer one, because people prefer that taste. And that's what Jesus is describing here. No one after drinking old wine desires the new, because the old stuff's better. Why does Jesus bring this up? What are we supposed to understand here? And here was my explanation originally. I think he's making a statement about preference. Once a person has tasted the better option, then they're not going to choose the lesser option anymore. And I think the idea here could be that in listening to Jesus' message about the kingdom of God, the disciples were tasting something better than that old works-based justification system of the old law. And when they had gotten a taste of that, they wouldn't want to return back to the law of Moses and all those stringent commands that they were under. They would want to be and prefer to be under the law of Christ. Having tasted the better of the two systems, they would not want to return to the system of their ancestors. Jesus' new way was better in every way. And that's really the point of the book of Hebrews. So I concluded here, even though their initial question was only about fasting, it seems Jesus was giving them a broader principle with which to evaluate all of the questions that they had about his ministry and about his teaching. Okay, now that gets a little complex. And there's some spots in there that I'm still not in love with. So now let me present to you my newer interpretation and a much simpler interpretation. Remember the context. John's disciples come to Jesus and they ask him why his disciples don't fast. He responds to them, because this is a time of celebration. This is like a wedding feast. And it would not make any sense at all if the guests at a wedding were fasting. It's a time of celebration. He then gives 3 illustrations of things that people don't do because it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't put a new patch on an old garment. You wouldn't put new wine into old wineskins. And you wouldn't choose new wine over old wine. People wouldn't do that. It wouldn't make sense. And I think that's the point. I think that's the explanation of all 3 of those. He basically told them, it would not make sense for my disciples to fast at this time because of the spiritual realities that are surrounding them. The Messiah is here. It's a great time of celebration that God's kingdom has come to the earth. And if they are going to behave appropriately for that time of celebration, then they're not going to act in unreasonable ways. Here's 3 ways that a person would act unreasonably. My disciples aren't going to do that while I'm here. I think it's probably that simple. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, so I actually heard this in a YouTube comment that somebody left. And I get a broad range of like the value of YouTube comments. Some of them are pretty good, and then some of them are like practically incoherent. but this guy left this big long message, and in a very roundabout way, he said all Jesus is saying by using these illustrations is that it wouldn't make sense to do these things, just like it wouldn't make sense for his apostles to fast while he was there. And I was like, could it really? Could it really be that simple? And I think he's right. I think that is the explanation. And that there's a good lesson there about a couple things. Number one, overthinking a text. Yeah, I remember sitting here for a couple hours grinding my mind over this and trying to figure out how all these pieces fit into place with this old covenant, new covenant explanation that I was trying to work through. I think I was overthinking it. Sometimes it's just best to like step back from a text and then come back to it and be like, okay, let's start again. let's figure this out. And there's a temptation, I think, to overthink a text sometimes because you want to pull out like this meaty explanation that's going to have all these applications in it. For people, Bible teachers want to see something new in a text and be able to lay it out for people in like this awe-inspiring way and this deep way, and sometimes your pride can play into that because you want to be seen as somebody who really can get down into the nitty-gritty of the text and get it figured out. But yeah, I think I just overthought it. And you have to be careful sometimes. Sometimes it's just, and Jesus was talking to simple people, and sometimes the explanations are simple. The second thing I thought about was that this is why it's important to constantly be reevaluating what you think you know. I mean, I wrote this down in a book, and I give it out to people. I was somewhat confident in this explanation. It's the best that I could do, at least. And if I didn't have an attitude that I was going to be constantly a student and constantly reevaluating texts and asking whether or not what I thought was there was actually there, then I would have just stubbornly held to my original interpretation. I think I would have been wrong about it. And maybe that wouldn't have been the biggest deal, with a text like this, but there's other huge issues in our religious life, in our Bible study, that we need to figure out. We need to get them right. And if we give up the attitude of a student once we conclude on some interpretation, then we could be potentially rejecting true interpretations down the road, if that makes any sense. And I know some men and women who have studied the Bible in their earlier years, and it's like they read the text that they felt like they needed to, and they're never going to reevaluate those texts. They're never going to go back to them. They've been teaching them the same way for 50 years because they've concluded that they've already got it figured out. Right? So there's no reason to go back and reevaluate. And I think that's just a dangerous way to be, and we might be depriving ourselves of what's actually there if we had a misinterpretation the first time. So a couple of people have asked me, well, what happens if you find out the stuff that is in your books is wrong? Well, I got to rewrite them, right? I got to change those sections, and I hope I don't ever quit doing that under the assumption that I've already got it sorted. Okay, rant over. But anyway, I think that's my working understanding. Real simple. And if you have any more questions about that, or if you ever question my interpretations and think you have an easier explanation, leave it down in the comments, because you just might change my mind. So, all right, well, that's the end of chapter 5. Excellent. There's a section for notes at the end of the chapter where maybe you want to write that interpretation in instead of the one that I have there. And you might want to check out the chapter 6 in 5 minutes section that's coming up right before the next chapter. All right, well, until tomorrow, I hope you guys have a great day.